Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other profound, real and disturbing narratives like this one. Every week, new stories explore mysteries, human decisions and secrets that time has tried to hide. Now, write in the comments, where are you watching from? Your city, your country? It's always impressive to see how far these stories reach. When Sarah Winchester arrived in the Santa Clara Valley, California, the place was not yet the pulsating heart of technology it would one day become. It was a quiet territory, marked by sprawling orchards, dirt roads, and a morning mist that seemed to conceal more than it revealed. The house she initially bought didn't stand out, a large but ordinary building with a few floors and simple porches. Nothing there suggested that decades later, that place would become one of the strangest and most unsettling buildings in the United States. Sarah arrived alone. There was no husband, no children, no close friends celebrating her new phase. Just crates, heavy furniture, and a woman always dressed in black with restrained movements and a distant gaze. The neighbors noticed from the beginning that she avoided long conversations. She greeted politely, but never lingered. She didn't ask questions about the area, nor did she show the curiosity common to someone starting from scratch in a new place. She came from a life marked by successive losses. First, the death of her daughter as a baby. Then years later, the death of her husband, heir to one of the largest industrial fortunes in the country. The Winchester rifle factory had armed soldiers, civilians, hunters, and had also fueled conflicts, deaths, and massacres. Sarah inherited not only enough money to live hundreds of comfortable lives, but also an invisible weight, difficult to name, yet constant. While many imagined that fortune would be used for travel, social events, or philanthropy, Sarah did something unexpected. She began renovating the house. At first, small changes, an enlarged room, a relocated staircase, an enclosed balcony. Workers were hired quickly, paid on time, and dismissed without explanation when they asked too many questions. What was striking wasn't the renovation itself, but the pace. There were no breaks. The work went on day and night, in sun or rain. Hammers were banging when most of the city slept. Trucks arrived before dawn. New workers replaced the old ones without anyone understanding why. Gradually, the house began to transform into something difficult to comprehend. Doors that opened onto walls, staircases that ended at the ceiling, narrow corridors that led nowhere, windows installed in the floor, steps of irregular heights, as if they had been designed to confuse anyone trying to climb quickly. Sarah rarely explained her decisions. When she did, her answers were practical, almost cold. She would only say that she needed more space, that she liked changes, that she preferred not to repeat floor plans. But her actions contradicted any known architectural logic. Engineers who worked on the project commented amongst themselves in hushed voices that it wasn't improvisation. There was intention in the chaos. Over time, the comments began, first discreet, then inevitable. Some said Sarah had gone mad after so many losses. Others claimed she was hiding from the world. There were those who said the house was being built for something no one else could see. Sarah's behavior also changed. She began to move around the house at specific times, as if following an invisible map. Certain rooms were visited daily, others never. On some nights, candles were lit in random spots around the house, forming patterns that only she seemed to understand. On others, bells were hung and removed without warning. The workers noticed strange rules. Never work in the same room 2 days in a row. Never question changes made during the early morning hours. Never stay in the house after sunset. Anyone who broke these rules was dismissed the next day, without discussion. There were no records of social visits, no parties, no celebrations, just the constant sound of construction, as if the house were alive, breathing, growing in an organic and unsettling way. The antagonism didn't present itself in a clear human form. There was no visible enemy, no declared rival or direct threat. The conflict was pervasive, ingrained in Sarah's silent decisions and in the very structure of the house. Something seemed to push her forward, compelling her to continue, as if stopping were unthinkable or dangerous. And the question began to circulate not only among neighbors, but also among journalists and curious onlookers from other cities. Why did Sarah Winchester never stop building? It wasn't just eccentricity, it wasn't just mourning. There was something more, something that manifested itself not in words, but in wood, nails, impossible corridors, and architectural choices that defied any rational explanation. The house grew, and along with it grew the unease of those observing from the outside, sensing that the construction concealed a purpose that no one was yet ready to face. The Santa Clara Valley, at the end of the 19th century, was a place in transition. The big cities still seemed distant, and life followed a rhythm dictated by the land, the harvests, and the few industries that were beginning to emerge. In this seemingly tranquil setting, Sarah Winchester's property stood out like an open wound in the landscape. While the other houses remained static, aging with time, hers transformed daily, as if refusing any form of conclusion. The residents of the area began to see the mansion not just as a strange building, but as an element that altered the behavior of those around it. Animals avoided certain areas of the property. Workers reported feeling disoriented even from the outside, as if the irregular layout of the house affected their perception of space. None of this was officially discussed, but everyone felt it. Sarah maintained a rigid routine. She always woke up before sunrise, walked through specific corridors, and made notes in small, dark-covered notebooks. They weren't conventional architectural plans. They were symbols, repeated numbers, measurements that didn't follow common patterns. The number 13 appeared frequently. 13 steps on stairs, 13 windows in certain rooms, chandeliers with 13 candles. It wasn't an aesthetic whim, it was a method. Few employees stayed long enough to get to know her habits more closely. Among them, an experienced foreman, hired on recommendation, noticed something unsettling. Sarah's orders almost never came with explanations, but always anticipated events. A corridor was closed off shortly before a collapse in another wing. A room was isolated days before a worker suffered an accident nearby. It didn't seem like a coincidence, but there was also no way to prove intent. Sarah's figure contrasted sharply with the space she created. She was discreet, spoke softly, moved carefully, like someone who preferred not to draw attention. The house, on the other hand, did the opposite. It drew attention through its clutter, its asymmetry, its constant feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the mansion expressed everything that Sarah had kept repressed. The past was beginning to seep into the local narrative. The Winchester fortune was well known. The rifles that bore the family name had been present in recent conflicts, in massacres of indigenous peoples, in crimes reported in the newspapers of the time. For many, Sarah represented a distant heiress to this violence, someone who lived surrounded by blood-stained money, even though she had never pulled a trigger. This historical context weighed heavily on how she was viewed. Some residents believed the house was an attempt at redemption. Others that it was self-imposed punishment. Still others said that Sarah was not paying for her own sins, but for inherited ones. Secondary characters began to gain importance. Journalists appeared, trying to understand the obsession. Religious figures offered spiritual comfort, always politely refused. Renowned engineers abandoned the project after a few days, unable to comprehend the logic behind the decisions. Each person who came into contact with Sarah left with more questions than answers. The mansion also seemed to shape those who worked there. Workers reported strange dreams after long periods of service. Some dreamed of corridors that moved, others of doors that closed by themselves. No two accounts were identical, but they all carried the same feeling. The house was watching. Culturally, the United States was experiencing a period of fascination with spiritualism. Mediumistic seances, communication with the dead, and beliefs in the afterlife were spreading among the upper classes. Sarah was familiar with this movement. Books on the subject were present in her library, although they were never seen open on tables or armchairs. It was as if she absorbed these ideas without explicitly demonstrating adherence. The antagonism was beginning to take shape, albeit diffusely. It wasn't a clear entity, nor a specific person. It was the sum of the violent past, the deaths associated with the Winchester name, the cultural environment that mixed guilt and superstition, and the house itself, which was becoming a physical extension of this silent conflict. Nothing was explained directly. Everything was suggested by the choices, the silences, the constant changes in the mansion's structure. The world around Sarah seemed to pressure her to keep building, as if stopping meant confronting something she refused to name. And as the house grew, so did the feeling that this construction was not just a shelter, but a response, albeit incomplete, to a threat that was slowly approaching. Over the years, the construction ceased to be merely an eccentric hobby and began to generate real consequences. The mansion was no longer just strange, it had become operationally dangerous. The number of accidents increased despite constant changes in the team, unexplained falls, tools plummeting from upper floors for no apparent reason, floors collapsing even after careful inspections. None of this made Sarah interrupt the pace of the work. Each incident was followed by immediate alterations to the structure. A flight of stairs was removed after a fall. An entire hallway was closed off after a worker reported being lost inside for hours. There was no formal investigation, only direct action. The house responded to events as if it were being adjusted after miscalculations, not human errors, but failures of a larger system. Tensions between Sarah and the technical team were mounting. Architects tried to impose logic, minimum safety standards, and structural coherence. Sarah refused them all. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't argue, she simply replaced professionals. The project didn't depend on external approval. Her fortune allowed her total independence, and this independence fueled the central conflict. No one could stop or understand the progress of the construction. The house's environment began to affect decisions beyond the construction site. Local authorities received anonymous complaints about structural risks. Inspections were scheduled, but they always found wings temporarily closed off, blueprints altered the night before, spaces that simply ceased to exist. The house was transforming too quickly to be effectively monitored. Secondary characters began to interfere directly in the conflict. One particularly persistent journalist started connecting events. Dates of accidents at the mansion coincided with anniversaries of massacres reported years earlier, many involving Winchester rifles. Another observed that certain renovations took place shortly after news of violent deaths was published in the newspapers. Sarah never commented on these coincidences, but the renovations happened with unsettling precision. The antagonism ceased to be abstract and began to weigh on daily life. Workers refused to return. New workers demanded higher wages, as if the risk were palpable. Home began to be avoided not only out of superstition, but out of a concrete feeling of instability. It wasn't fear of ghosts. It was fear of something active, in motion. Sarah, for her part, showed signs of physical exhaustion. She walked more slowly, leaning on the uneven handrails she herself had ordered to be built. Even so, her determination remained intact. Each morning brought new orders. Each night, silent alterations made under her direct supervision. The conflict was not merely external, it was internal, fought between human fatigue and an obligation that seemed non-negotiable. The house began to display clearer patterns. Certain wings were constantly being modified, as if they were never quite right. Others remained untouched for years, isolated, sealed off, When questioned about these spaces, Sarah simply looked away. She didn't deny access. She made it impossible. External events intensified the pressure. An earthquake struck the region, causing significant damage to the structure. Any other building would have been condemned. The mansion, however, was not abandoned. Sarah ordered immediate reconstructions, not to restore what existed before, but to completely alter the layout. The natural disaster was not treated as an interruption, but as an opportunity. This moment marked a clear shift in the conflict. The house ceased to merely react to past events and began to anticipate them. New wings emerged with false exits, confusing routes, spaces designed to slow down, disorient, contain. It was no longer just construction. It was defense. The central conflict became evident to outside observers. Sarah was at war with something that didn't manifest itself directly. There were no public appearances, no declarations, just a succession of architectural decisions that seemed to respond to an invisible yet constant threat. And the more the house grew, the clearer it became that the real risk wasn't structural, financial, or social. The risk was the moment Sarah stopped, because everything indicated that the construction wasn't a whim, it was a fragile balance. A silent agreement maintained with wood, nails, and impossible corridors. To stop would mean breaking that balance, and nobody, not even Sarah Winchester, seemed willing to find out what would happen next. As the mansion expanded, parallel stories began to form around it, inevitably intertwining with the main conflict. None of these subplots existed by chance. They all orbited the house, as if drawn to its unsettling presence. One of the first things to gain traction was the relationship between the workers and the imposed silence. Many laborers began to create their own survival codes. They discreetly marked walls, left tools in specific positions, and avoided certain times and corridors. It wasn't collective superstition, but adaptation. They perceived patterns that no one dared to officially record. Some even worked only in pairs, not for structural safety, but to ensure that no one disappeared unnoticed. Another narrative thread developed with the press. A local reporter, discredited by his colleagues, began to investigate the story obsessively. He wasn't looking for ghosts, but inconsistencies. He discovered that parts of the house were built on old foundations, reused from demolished structures in other states. Wood, doors, and stained glass had varied origins, many coming from regions marked by armed conflict. None of this was illegal, but the patterns suggested symbolic intent, not economy. This subplot deepened the idea that the mansion wasn't just built in the present, but carried fragments of the past. Each piece seemed to bring with it a previous history, as if the house accumulated physical memories. The reporter tried to confront Sarah with these discoveries, but never managed to get a formal interview. Whenever he got close to an answer, the house changed. Literally, a wing was closed off, an access point disappeared, and the focus of the investigation was lost. Meanwhile, the pressure of time arose. Sarah's advanced age became a central factor. Doctors began visiting her more frequently. They recommended rest, reduced activity, predictability. Nothing was followed. Sarah's biological clock seemed irrelevant in the face of another invisible countdown. While her body weakened, the construction accelerated. This urgency affected the narrative's rhythm. Works that previously took weeks were now being done in days. Decisions were made without revisions. Some structures seemed deliberately provisional, as if they didn't need to last. The feeling was one of preparation for something imminent, not of permanence. Another subplot involved the local residents. The house began to influence the value of the surrounding land. Some saw it as a tourist opportunity, others as a threat. Attempts to buy the property arose, always refused. Community meetings discussed the possibility of legal intervention, but nothing progressed. Concrete evidence was lacking, and Sarah's figure, despite being eccentric, remained legally untouchable. The most unsettling element, however, was internal. Certain rooms began to be used only at specific times. Some were accessed only once a month, others only at night. This routine did not follow official religious dates, but seemed to obey its own calendar. Those observing from afar could see that the house did not grow randomly. It reorganized itself cyclically. The subplots converged on the same tension. Time was running out, not for the house but for Sarah. Each secondary character, workers, journalists, doctors, residents, reacted to this realization differently, but all felt that something needed to be resolved before construction was forcibly interrupted, whether by death or external intervention. The complexity of the plot lay not in revealing a specific secret, but in showing how multiple pressures pushed the story toward a breaking point. The mansion was not merely the stage for the conflict, it was the mechanism that kept all the subplots in motion, forcing decisions, accelerating events, and eliminating alternatives. Everything indicated that this unstable equilibrium could not be sustained for much longer, and when it broke, neither party would emerge unscathed. The breaking point didn't come with a clear warning, nor with a spectacular event visible to all. It began almost imperceptibly in a silent early morning when Sarah Winchester abandoned her own routine. For the first time in decades, a wing of the house remained untouched for more than 24 hours. No hammer, no saw, no orders written in her notebooks. The workers noticed immediately. The absence of instructions created a strange void, as if the house had lost its pulse. Some interpreted it as a sign that construction was finally nearing completion. Others felt the opposite. The pause seemed dangerous, unnatural. Sarah had retreated to one of the oldest rooms in the mansion, a space that had remained virtually unchanged since the initial purchase of the property. There were no false staircases there, nor illusory doors. It was a simple, almost austere environment, contrasting violently with the labyrinth around it. This room was not part of the cycle of changes. It never had been. That night, something changed definitively. Sarah gathered for the first time old records, discarded blueprints, notebooks, lists of dates and events. As she organized them, a pattern became impossible to ignore. The renovations weren't just reacting to past deaths or external events. They followed a progression. Each phase of construction corresponded to a specific historical period linked to the violence associated with the Winchester name. As the house grew, these periods drew closer to the present. What was once symbolic restraint had become something more urgent. The house wasn't paying off an endless debt, it was counting down. The revelation didn't come through a mystical vision or a visible entity. It came through the cold logic of numbers, dates, and recurrences. Sarah realized that if the pattern continued, it would reach a point where there would be no more room to build. And when that happened, the cycle would close. During the same period, an external event intensified the turnaround. An arson fire struck a newly constructed wing. Unlike previous damage, the fire did not spread as expected. It remained concentrated in specific corridors, destroying only structures that had been erected in recent months. The rest of the house remained intact. This fire was not treated as an accident. Sarah ordered that wing not be rebuilt in the same way. For the first time, she retreated. Instead of replacing what had been lost, she redesigned the space to create deliberate voids, areas without function, dead spaces. This decision marked a radical shift in the direction of history. Construction ceased to be about continuous expansion and became about conscious containment. It was no longer about deceiving, delaying, or confusing something external, but about preparing the house for a controlled closure. The reactions around us were immediate. The journalist interpreted the fire as proof that something out of control was happening. Authorities intensified surveillance. Workers began to resign en masse. The house, once active and noisy, entered a state of silent tension. Sarah, for her part, showed a visible transformation. Her weariness was no longer merely physical. Her decisions became more direct, less numerous, but more definitive. She began to walk through corridors she had previously avoided. She faced sealed doors. She remained in absolute silence for long periods, like someone preparing for an inevitable confrontation. The real turning point, however, came when she ordered the permanent closure of one of the last possible expansion routes for the house. An access that would have allowed continued construction indefinitely was irreversibly blocked, not for lack of resources, but by choice. This action clearly revealed that Sarah was finally accepting what she had avoided for decades. The construction could not continue forever. The purpose was not to perpetuate the chaos, but to reach a specific point, a limit. The house didn't react with collapses or visible phenomena. It reacted with unsettling stability, as if it had recognized the change in strategy, as if the game had entered its final phase. From that moment on, nothing could ever be the same again. The conflict is no longer about maintaining the balance indefinitely. It became about Asto shut it down, and who would pay the price when that happened? Sarah Winchester's decision to halt the mansion's continued expansion had immediate effects, both visible and subtle. The first impact was the silence. The constant absence of hammers and saws created a sonic void that spread throughout the property like a warning. That house, accustomed to incessant movement, seemed suspended in expectation. The workers who remained noticed changes in the behavior of the space. Corridors that were once confusing became strangely easy to traverse. Doors that never aligned properly now closed precisely. There was no sense of relief, only the perception that something had been internally reorganized. The house was no longer trying to avoid an end, it was preparing for it. Human reactions were varied. Local authorities interpreted the slowdown as an opportunity to intervene. New inspections were scheduled, now with greater rigor. Unlike before, they encountered no direct resistance. Entire wings were open, exposed, as if Sarah no longer had any interest in concealing the structure. Still, there were not enough irregularities to justify closing the property. The house remained standing, functional and disconcertingly stable. The journalist saw confirmation of his suspicions at that moment. He published a series of articles that stopped treating the mansion as an eccentricity and began describing it as a deliberate project of historical containment. The articles generated national curiosity, but also criticism. Concrete evidence was lacking. The public oscillated between fascination and disbelief. Sarah didn't react publicly to any of this. Her actions became even more silent. She began to reduce access, not to confuse, but to guide. Certain paths were reinforced. Others abandoned. The house began to take on a final form, even though no one could define what it was. Physically, Sarah showed clear signs of decline. She walked with difficulty, ate little, and slept in short periods. Even so, she remained completely lucid. Every decision seemed calculated, as if she were managing scarce resources, not financial, but temporal. The most disturbing consequence was emotional. For the first time, Sarah demonstrated something close to vulnerability. Not in words, but in gestures. She began to leave doors open that she had previously kept closed. She allowed certain areas to be seen by outsiders. There was no longer any effort to hide the process. It was as if she accepted that closure required witnesses. The atmosphere of the house reflected this transition. There were no collapses, no spectacular manifestations. There was order, a rigid, almost clinical order. Each space seemed to fulfill a specific function, even if that function was not obvious. The labyrinth did not disappear. It was refined. Relationships around the mansion adjusted to this new phase. Residents of the area began to observe the mansion with less fear and more unease. The danger didn't seem to have gone away. It had only changed form. What was once chaotic was now intentional. At this stage, the conflict ceased to be active and became latent. No new obstacles were being created. Consequences were being absorbed. The house, Sarah, and the world around them entered a period of tense waiting, as if everyone knew the decisive moment was near, but no one dared to hasten it. The biggest consequence of the change in strategy was psychological. Sarah stopped reacting to something external and started acting based on an internal outcome. It was no longer a struggle to distance herself from the past, but to decide how to confront it when time ran out. Nothing seemed out of control, and that, more than any previous accident, was deeply disturbing. The phase that followed marked the quietest and perhaps most profound change in Sarah Winchester's trajectory. There were no announcements, no abrupt decisions visible to the public. The growth didn't happen through physical expansion, but through internal transformation, reflected in the actions she began to take within the house. For the first time, Sarah began to undo, not chaotic demolitions, but precise removals. False doors were taken down. Staircases that led nowhere were permanently sealed. Excessively long corridors were shortened. Each intervention seemed like a fine-tuning, as if she were correcting distortions accumulated over decades. This process demanded a different kind of courage. Building had always been a way of avoiding. Undoing required confronting past choices, acknowledging excesses, accepting failures. Sarah didn't verbalize this, but her actions were unmistakable. The house began to lose some of its architectural aggressiveness. The chaos didn't disappear, but it ceased to be dominant. New challenges arose. By removing layers of clutter, previously isolated spaces became connected. Areas that had never coexisted before began to meet. This generated unexpected tensions. Certain parts of the house reacted poorly to simplification, requiring careful solutions to maintain stability. Balance was no longer guaranteed by expansion, but by precision. Sarah's growth was also evident in how she interacted with those around her. She began giving clearer instructions, albeit few. She didn't tolerate improvisation. Each worker had a specific and temporary role. There was no more constant turnover. Those who remained needed to understand that this phase did not allow for repeated mistakes. The journalist, noticing the change, tried to approach her again. This time, Sarah allowed brief encounters, always in neutral spaces in the house. She offered no explanations, but she also didn't avoid questions. Her silence ceased to be defensive and became deliberate. She no longer needed to convince anyone of anything. The arc of personal transformation became visible in small habits. Sarah began to rest at regular times. She ate more consistently. He reduced the number of daily decisions, focusing only on those that truly mattered. It wasn't surrendering to tiredness, but conscious energy management. The biggest challenge of this phase was resisting the temptation to revert to the old pattern. Whenever instability arose, the easiest solution would have been to build more, complicate things, deviate. Sarah chose the opposite. She faced the problem directly, adjusting, reinforcing, accepting physical and symbolic limits. This choice represented real growth. For the first time, she recognized that the house didn't need to absorb all the weight of the past. Part of that weight needed to be borne by herself, as an individual, not as the architect of an endless labyrinth. The overcoming wasn't dramatic. There was no visible catharsis, no moment of triumph. It was a slow process marked by consistent decisions. The house began to reflect this. Still strange, still disconcerting, but now coherent with itself. Sarah's internal conflict had shifted in nature. It was no longer about escaping inherited consequences, but about accepting that some of them could not be neutralized by physical structures. The house could contain, direct, delay, but not erase. By the end of this phase, something fundamental had changed. Sarah no longer seemed a hostage to the construction. She was guiding it with clear intention. Personal growth hadn't eliminated the imminent danger, but it had prepared her to face it without resorting to old escape mechanisms. And this preparation, silent and meticulous, indicated that the decisive moment was drawing ever closer. The preparation for the final moment did not occur in a visible or dramatic way. There were no announcements, nor major structural changes that immediately drew attention. What happened was a silent acceleration of the house's internal logic, as if all paths were gradually beginning to converge. Sarah focused her efforts on resolving outstanding issues. Subplots that had developed over the years began to naturally come to a head. The journalist was granted final access to certain records, enough to understand the overall intention, but not to reveal everything. He understood that certain answers would not be made public, and that forcing this could compromise something larger. His investigation reached a limit, which he reluctantly accepted. The remaining workers were reduced to a minimum number. Each one knew exactly when their work would end. There were no promises of continuity. The tasks were specific: reinforce a support here, seal a passage there, ensure that certain routes remained intact. Nothing was random. The house was being prepared to function on its own. Sarah began to follow specific routes every day, always in the same order, not out of habit, but for verification. Each passage, each door, each detour now had a clear purpose for her. The labyrinth no longer existed to confuse, it existed to guide her. The tension grew, not because of new external events, but because of their absence. No accidents, no accusations, no attempts at intervention. The world around seemed to hold its breath. The house remained stable, but heavy with expectation. Symbolic elements reappeared, this time in a restrained way. The number 13 appeared only at the endpoints of important routes. Candles were positioned not to distance, but to mark. There was no more excess. Everything was minimal, functional. Sarah resolved the last internal subplots by definitively closing areas that would have no role in the ending. Rooms that had been fundamental in the past were sealed off without ceremony. There was no nostalgia, only necessity. The past had served its purpose. The pressure of time became explicit. Sarah's health was fluctuating. Doctors were dismissed. She no longer sought to prolong anything. She sought to align the remaining time with the ultimate purpose. Each day was treated as a finite resource. The house, now almost silent, seemed to respond with absolute precision. No unnecessary creaking, no instability. It was as if the entire structure had been calibrated for a single event, not destructive, but conclusive. External relations were resolved through exhaustion. Residents stopped protesting. Authorities shelved cases. The mansion, which once generated fear and curiosity, came to be seen as something closed in on itself, inaccessible to common logic. The final preparation didn't involve reinforcing defenses or creating new obstacles. It involved eliminating everything superfluous. The house became a clear, albeit winding line, leading to a central point. Sarah displayed an unprecedented calm. There was no more rush, no hesitation, just execution. The personal growth from previous phases had allowed for this serenity. She wasn't protecting herself, she was positioning herself. At the end of this preparation, everything was ready. There were no more decisions to make, nor adjustments to be made. The climax would not depend on improvisation, but on the activation of something carefully prepared over decades. The house awaited. Sarah was waiting, and the conflict, finally concentrated, was about to reveal itself in an irreversible way. The climax didn't begin with noise. It began with alignment. That night, Sarah Winchester walked through the house for the last time, following the complete route from the outermost point to the inner core of the mansion. Every door opened without resistance. Every corridor responded exactly as it had been designed. There were no unexpected detours. The labyrinth, for the first time, functioned as a continuous line. In the center of the house was a space that didn't attract attention. No ornamentation, no architectural extravagance. A simple room, supported by reinforced pillars, positioned at the point where multiple wings converged. That space had existed for years, but had never been the final destination of any journey until now. Sarah went inside and closed the door behind her. There were no direct witnesses. The climax didn't require an audience. What happened there wasn't an explicit supernatural manifestation. There were no apparitions, voices, or shadows moving across the walls. The confrontation was structural, almost mechanical. The house, designed to contain, began to fulfill its primary function. External doors sealed themselves automatically using simple but effective systems. Internal routes were used to direct any residual movement away from the core. The mansion became a closed system, not to trap anyone inside, but to prevent any external interference. Sarah activated the final mechanism, accepting the limit. For decades, construction had served to delay, divert, and absorb. Now it served to concentrate. All that had been fragmented, memories, responsibilities, historical consequences, symbolically converged at that central point, not as entities, but as accumulated weight. The climactic twist was silent and plausible. There was nothing to be defeated outside of it. The antagonism was never an external force seeking direct revenge. It was the sum of unacknowledged consequences, artificially prolonged by the house's endless expansion. By definitively halting growth and aligning the structure for closure, Sarah didn't liberate anything. She summed. Physically, the effort was enormous. Her already weakened body reacted with clear limitations. Sarah remained seated in the center of the room for hours, while the house around her descended into total stillness. No response, no automatic adjustment. The system had been completed. The central conflict was resolved there, not with destruction, but with final containment. The house no longer needed to grow because its function had been fulfilled. The regressive cycle had reached its 0 point. The protagonist's transformation became visible in the final act. Sarah didn't try to escape, nor to alter the outcome. She didn't seek to prolong it. Her conscious choice was to remain, not as punishment, but as a responsibility. When day broke, the mansion was intact. No wing had collapsed. No part showed any damage. From the outside, everything looked the same. But inside, something fundamental had ceased. Sarah Winchester was found in the center of the house, with no signs of violence, no expression of fear, just absolute silence. The doctor certified natural failure, consistent with age and physical wear and tear. Nothing more than that. The real turning point wasn't the death, but what didn't happen afterward. In the following days, the house did not react. There were no accidents, no unexplained noises, no structural changes. For the first time since the beginning, the mansion remained completely still. The climax revealed the central truth of the story. Sarah wasn't running from ghosts. She was preventing the story from continuing to expand irresponsibly, and by bringing it to a close, she brought an end to a cycle that no one else could sustain. After Sarah Winchester's death, the mansion fell into a state of complete immobility. Contrary to what many expected, there was no structural collapse or accelerated decay. The house remained exactly as it had been left, as if it had been completed at the very last moment. The authorities carried out thorough inspections. No serious irregularities were found. The structure, although illogical in many respects, was surprisingly solid. There were no signs of uncontrolled abandonment, nor evidence of imminent danger. What had previously seemed an unstable organism revealed itself to be a precisely enclosed system. The journalist published his last article, this time without speculation. He described the mansion not as a supernatural mystery, but as an extreme project of moral and historical restraint. The text generated intense debate. Some readers saw it as an act of conscious atonement. others a belated justification for obsession and isolation. No interpretation became definitive, and that seemed appropriate. The house began receiving visitors. Guides walked the corridors, explaining the interrupted staircases, the doors that led nowhere, the confusing paths. What had once caused fear began to cause curiosity. However, something essential had changed. People got lost less often. Not because the house had been altered, but because it could no longer withstand the test of time. The atmosphere no longer conveyed a sense of urgency. There was no feeling of being watched. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was neutral. The house demanded nothing more. In the long run, the impact was symbolic. Sarah Winchester's story came to be cited as an extreme example of how the past can be managed, not erased, but embraced. The mansion became an unwitting monument to belated accountability, not to madness. The residents of the area, previously divided between fear and rejection, began to see the building as part of the landscape. Not a foreign object, but a landmark, something that belonged to the place, even if not fully understood. The narrative arc concluded without excess. There were no additional revelations, nor attempts to explain every detail. The coherence lay in the whole, not in the individual answers. Sarah Winchester was neither redeemed nor condemned. She was understood within the limits of what was possible. Her journey did not end in victory or defeat, but in closure. And the house, finally immovable, became what it was always meant to be, not a labyrinth to confuse, but a carefully constructed endpoint. Years later, visitors still wander the corridors of the old Winchester mansion, trying to find a hidden meaning. Some believe they sense something in the quieter spaces, others see only wood, doors, and poorly positioned staircases. No experience is the same. What remains constant is the absence of change. The house doesn't grow, it doesn't react. It doesn't demand anything. Among so many paths that lead nowhere, there is an unspoken understanding. The mystery lies not in what the house hides, but in what it once contained. And perhaps, precisely for that reason, nothing there needs to be revealed. Now that you've reached the end of this story, the question remains: was Sarah Winchester running from her past, or taking on a responsibility that no one else wanted to bear? Each dead-end corridor, each interrupted staircase, can be seen as madness, or as a conscious choice in the face of a historical weight impossible to erase. Share your interpretation. Do you believe the house was a prison, a defense, or a carefully planned endpoint? Share your thoughts, discuss with other readers, and decide for yourself. What would you have done if the past knocked on your door every day?